Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Coffee with Captain, our final episode of the year. This morning, we have Patrick Smith joining us, Captain Jan Miles, and myself, Chief Mate Jeff Crosby. And Captain Miles, what have we been up to for the past week?
Well, you've been finishing up the galley. Boy, does it look shiny.
That's many layers.
Yeah. The still got a ways to go there. We've been doing a fair amount of focusing on next year with crewing up. You've got some winter folks coming, so the business of hygiene and safety protocols have been under a lot of discussion. I've made a presentation to the volunteers of the National Park Service locally related to Fort McHenry and other parts of what they do for volunteering as a way of talking about something they talk about, which is the Star Spangled Banner and the privateers that created that story, and the new partnership for this next summer, the Heritage Area National Park Star Spangled Banner Gateway partnership, or the ship will be an ambassador for those stories for the local heritage areas around the bay. So as the new year is coming, it's like, oh my goodness, we got things to do.
Yeah, it's getting closer and closer and closer to sailing time. We had a snowstorm come through. How did we fare throughout that?
Gee, there's nearly nothing down home, which is only 20 odd miles away to the south and east, closer to the bay. The ship here, as you know, better than me, maybe 2 to 3 inches. That got compacted down pretty quickly because of freezing rain. So we have a lot of ice here at the ship, but that's in terms of the cover and the parking lot, and that's fast going away. The temperature is remaining cold. So you've done a great job of setting me up down here in the saloon of the Pride of Baltimore. So thank you very much.
Yeah, get you out of the freezing temps. It won't get warm until this afternoon for sure. Yeah, so this morning we're going to have a conversation about the ins and outs of getting Pride out of the water. So to kind of start off the conversation, how much does Pride weigh?
She's using the long ton, which is not always used among a lot of the yachting world, a smaller boat world anyway. The long ton, 2,240 pounds. So the long ton, she's 185 to 190 long tons. So the old boat was measured the same way. So more than 400,000 pounds, I'm guessing.
Sure. which is not able to be hauled by your everyday average travel lift at a marina. So we have to find different options to haul Pride. What are the kind of different scenarios that have been involved with lifting Pride throughout her history?
So the traditional way of doing it would be a railway, in the sense of the first Pride of Baltimore, the classical way rather than traditional. The classical way would be a railway. But the Chesapeake Bay, with the advent of the second boat, over these years since World War II, have been both shallow on the one hand, but also losing a number of resources that would be the classical way of doing it with the railway. You need a lot of depth beyond the depth of the vessel, unlike a travel lift, where if you just have adequate depth for the vessel, you can use a travel lift. The trouble with traditional construction is there's a localizing of stresses when you lift that much weight built out of so many different pieces. So there's a bit of a reluctance to go with a travel lift if it was available, but they don't happen to be available in the Bay. There are some up in New England and elsewhere. So it's been a floating dry dock option here in Baltimore with General Ship and Dry Dock Repair over on Key Highway. And then later, when it became impossible for them due to a lot of clients that were steel vessels rather than wood vessels, we wound up going down to Norfolk and found a elevator, a platform that was on wires, which have to, because the platform is so big, 220 feet and long, and I can't remember the width, but it's all those wires have to be very carefully synchronized. You don't distort the platform. So synchrolift is the common reference to that, and so both of those work quite well. I like the floating dry dock the best because of the protection around the hull for reasons of wood drying. You're closer to the water where the,
right?
yeah, the big side walls for the buoyancy thing. There's some negatives with a floating dry dock only from the point of view of our personal experience, not from the point of view of the ship. The trouble with a sinker lift is that in the case of the one we used, and there's only the one down there, we were seeing the vessel way, way, way high over land, way, way, way high above water, way, way, way away from the water. And it's a parking lot with tarmac and concrete. And that sun and that breeze just dries the boat really rapidly. This is not what is happening as rapidly when you're in a floating dry dock.
Sure. So let's start with the first option. So the original Pride, she hauled out with a marine railway, and I think Patrick has a photo of the first Pride hauled out. So let's take a look at that and see what we can see there.
Yeah, so locally down in Curtis Bay is a long-lived yard, Smith Brothers. In fact, there's an interesting coincidence. My father owned a schooner in the war years. It was a bay type schooner in the sense of the Delaware Bay oyster schooners, a clipper bowed version. And he would go to Smith Brothers in Curtis Bay to have her hauled out there. The name of that boat was the LCM Reichert. But here we see the first Pride right near the Beltway at the south end, just inside the Beltway, is this here in Curtis Bay, is Pride hauled out there. And and I remember being there with her when I first joined her in 1981. Arminel Sesser had arranged to take her there, as she'd been there numerous times ahead of my first time as being commander of her. So that was not deep enough for the second Pride, and also over time, because there's just not a lot. The technology is more convenient when you're using floating dry docks and stuff. So they're not. So that railway is basically I believe, is non-functional right now.
Can you kind of describe the process of what it takes to haul the Pride, the original Pride, with a railway? You know, what's the setup like? What's the maneuver like?
Sure. So you have this arrangement on wheels that is made of girders and beams to create a grid for a series of blocks that can be mounted to take the shape of the boat, but also to take the keel on the center line. And then depending upon a variety of change designs, you can have a situation where the block arrangement is set up on sliders or maybe on a articulating arm. So you have all those pulled to the side, and you run the railway back down into the water to a point where it's understood that for the state of the tide and the draft of the ship, you have clearance. So the side of the railway has still got arms that stick up so that the yard crew can have a reference as to where this center line is. And so the master of the ship, with some assistance maybe from smaller boats and certainly dock lines, would then come into this arrangement of sides that are above the water that people are at, that the yard crew are at, to sort of take lines and then center the vessel in there, this grid between these two arrangements for folks with the railway. Once that's done, then the railway and the ship are pulled towards the land, and the railway, because of the rake of the rail tracks, will come up underneath the ship. And when the keel is landed, everything stops, and then you pull in the side blocking, and that it can be as many as 4 or 6 per side. So the crew on the railway car framework will have a system of lines or chains that are in a loop arrangement, and they can wind them out or wind them in this case, wind the blocking that's been preset based on the design of the ship, dimensions of the ship, and those come in and land against the hull. There's resistance, so the folks can't over crank those blocks and get them tipped over. And then that when that's all satisfied, and maybe somebody's going around in a small boat to check visually right at if the blocks are pretty close to the water line, to check for landing, square landing, or maybe a diver or a swimmer, if it's a warm day, will check that. But then the whole ensemble is dragged up the railway out of the water. It can be a jerky feeling because of the way the wheels have aged over time, or the track has aged over time, or even if the technology is chain or wire, there can be a different cycle of resistance and then release, and resistance and release. So it can be a little interesting to ride that thing up. But then once it's out of the water, there's a further amount of additional blocking set up, and a double checking of fairness to the curve of the planking for the blocking. So there's no sharp cornering, taking up load. And then as you see in this photograph, there have been some walking boards set up so that the workers on the hull can get around to certain aspects, certain levels of the hull pretty comfortably.
Sure. So the process is basically, as the rail is coming up, it's meeting up with the keel, and most of the weight of the boat is going to be sitting on that keel, and then those side blocks move in to kind of support it from tipping over, right?
Yeah, and so it's my understanding you're looking at something not less than 60% is loaded up on the keel structure. The way these vessels are built, and generally speaking, no matter what the material is this business of the center line taking a load and everything else supported by it is pretty common. That you want to put a lot less weight on your bilges, because you don't want them to be given the job of lifting the keel up off the bottom, because that could be very distortioning to the ship. It's also could be a crushing point at the poppets with that kind of thing. So with the number of blockings you have under the keel, your frequency of blocking or load bearing under the keel is probably every 2 feet on center. Whereas the blocks that come into the bilge, you might have a 1 foot square area that's spaced maybe one every 8 to 12 feet, and you're only going to get, say, 6 per side of the size of the Pride of Baltimore. Might be as little as First Pride, might be as little as 4. None of the skin planking can sustain any great weight. So yeah, it's an anti-tipping over with almost all the weight on the center line. So the blocks come in to keep it from tipping over. Yeah.
Sure. And Pride is the second vessel has never been hauled by Marine Railway. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Not because we tried to avoid it, though. It's just not available here in the Bay, and where we have, we've hauled out one place outside of the United States in Malaga, and their technology was floating dry dock, so it just wasn't a choice.
Yeah, it's kind of just, whatever options are available to haul a boat the Pride size.
Right.
So let's head down to Portsmouth, Virginia. We used to haul out at a place called Ocean Marine, and that's what's known as a sinker lift. So I think we have a couple photos of the cradle before it actually gets down into the water. So this is kind of describe the setup and the experience of lifting Pride down at Ocean Marine.
So a sinker lift is just the platform that is doing the lifting and the lowering. In the case of the outfit down in Portsmouth, Virginia, they also had a track system ashore that permitted, and it was a setup as a grid, permitted for coming off of the platform and then being tracked off to the side so that other customers could be continued to be launched or picked up. So they have a series of steel cars that they can assemble for length. So these cars are probably 20 feet long. And if you have a boat like Pride at 120, 100 on the hull, you put together a number of cars, and they're set up in a sort of a pattern where they have a center line arrangement to take the center line loading bridged across two longitudinals, which is where the wheels are, and the wheels are spaced every, say, 4 feet. It's a double I-beam arrangement, very stout. And so the center blocking you see here, but in the background, a little bit tough to see to decipher, is this angular metal structure mounted on a block. And so those are the side bilges, and they're set up with a worm gear arrangement to be able to have a diver go while the boat's loaded onto the center blocking, bring it to then bring in and screw up to resistance the side blocking. One little detail here, notice the center line blocking. I'm not sure it's clear, but it's a curve. Pride of Baltimore 2, unlike the first Pride, has what's termed as a rocker pattern underneath. So instead of it being straight arrow straight, it has this curve. And the reason for that curve was to help with the external ballast concentration. So the ballast the vertical thickness is a little bit greater in one area, fore or aft, in the middle of fore and aft, a little bit thinner. So that's very irritating to the yard to have to, it's incredibly beneficial to the boat with regards to making her meet stability regulations under subchapter T, but the yard now has to not only create this curve, but they then have to position the boat exactly in the fore and aft position to match that curve. So doing this in water is a real challenge of making sure your reference marks are set up. And so that there's a certain amount of time taken up with that before the elevator, the platform, the synchro lift can come up underneath. And you take and they have a weighing calculator on those wires, so they know how much they're picking up. So once they get a little bit, they'll send the diver to double check that everything's fine center line before they even worry about bringing in the side. Then they'll lift her up a little bit more to get most of the weight on the center line before those side things come in and they load up. Again, you don't want a lot of, they're just anti-tip over devices rather than real load carrying side blocking.
Sure, yeah, and I think we have some photos of the boat coming out of the water here at Ocean Marine. Kind of one kind of interesting observation. You know, with the Marine Railway, as the cradle comes up, it's kind of at an angle already, so it's a lot easier to match the water line. At Ocean Marine, they would set up that blocking to match the curve of the keel, so it came up with the water line parallel. And then when we've hauled out using a dry dock, a floating dry dock, we're always with the keel more or less even with the base of the dry dock, so the boat is kind of leaning forward. But we'll kind of see that as we shift into hauling out at general ship. So
Yeah.
you can see this photo of the boat rising out of the water.
Yeah, so she's oriented from the point of view of anybody looking on. She's oriented like a ship in a bottle or a model standing on a table. She's oriented the way she would be oriented in the water, and so it's all pretty normalized. That's also true for a railway. A railway will keep that waterline in line with the horizon most of the time. There's some exceptions to that, but more generally, it's close to the waterline on a railway.
You're not putting weird pressures in places as contact comes up.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
How long does this process take with the sinker lift coming out of the water?
In terms of once the ship is in and centered and blocked, the rate of the elevator, we're talking an hour of winch time taking things up. I could be a little bit exaggerated there because there's stopping points. It's somewhere along the line. And see, in our cases, you'll remember what they do is once they get the boat blocked before the final lift, they have a gangway sent over with one of with their people. We pick it up on board the ship, and then we are marched off the boat. Unlike a railway, the sinker lift, nobody's allowed to be on board, which is fine. So we march off the boat, and then the final lift occurs, and I think it's roughly not less than a half an hour, more like 45 minutes of listening to the winches work to bring her on up. And we're talking a draft change of the hull plus the blocking. So probably a 15 to 18 foot rise is taking more than a half an hour.
Sure. At Ocean Marine, generally speaking, how long was the process from arrival to being able to work on the boat on the Heart?
Oh, well, that could be quite adventurous because it couldn't take a very windy day and bring her up because of the rig. She'd rock and roll around, and they couldn't manage that. So it takes them roughly a day to 2 days to set up the cradle. And so we time our arrival after that cradle is set up, and with the idea that maybe we can go right straight into the slip there, having come down the length of the bay from Baltimore, and we'll do that on an overnighter, and then slip right in and go up. But then they say, well, it's too windy. Now the wind has been great for the ship to go down the bay, but it is not great for doing the lift. So then we have been tied up to wait for the wind to die. And I think the worst case scenario, it doesn't happen all the time, but nearly a third to half the time we've had to wait a while. And the worst case was almost 3 days.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So it's no small feat to get the boat out of the water, kind of waiting for the right conditions. They have to wait for the cradle to get set up, the yard to be ready. And then there's quite a bit of process of, moving the ship off the sinker lift, getting the whatever mechanism is necessary to get on board the vessel, whether I know we used a scissor lift at one point, and then they switched to building an actual staircase there. So that always takes a little bit of time. So kind of shifting to the third way, which is a floating dry dock. We've got some photos of the last haul out that we did, which was back at General Ship. And the boat hauled out at General Ship for a while and then shifted down to Portsmouth. That's right?
Yeah. General Ship during the 90s would handle us on an annual basis. And then we have another local operation, tug and barge for transport of oil that suddenly grew. There was a series of regulatory changes from single skin to double hull transportation of chemicals and oil. And this operation expanded from just being a harbor supply of fuel to local visiting ships. to a fairly major operation where they saw that regulation coming and they built new, and they wound up with a lot of business, and that meant a lot of steel maintenance was required. And general ship and dry dock repair is a steel yard. They make no bones about it. They don't try to service everybody. And so in the late 90s, it stopped being possible to even schedule a wooden boat. So a wooden boat at general ship is sort of just renting space. It's not a great wage, a rate earner. So understandingly, we were unable to book with general ship. So we had to go for an alternative. And we discovered this operation called Ocean Marine at the time, down in Portsmouth, Virginia, with the sinker lift. So they went out of business unexpectedly a couple of years ago. And so we were hunting around and learned from general ship that they weren't as busy as before. And so depending upon their busyness, they could fit us in. So we managed to get fitted in January of this year. We were looking for November of the year before, but we wound up.
So if Patrick can go back to the previous photo, this is us underway, leaving Clifton Street. We still had the winter cover on. We just cut some holes in for some visibility. And at this point, it was just the winter crew. So we weren't fully crewed up. I think we were at 6 of us total. I think you made 7. So we had a couple volunteers come down to help just with general dock lines and extra bodies, and made our way slowly across the bay, across the harbor to general ship. And I think Pat has some additional photos of us kind of jockeying into place. So that's the dry dock all prepped out, and they would have done the same work that Ocean Marine did with putting all the blocking in place to accommodate the rocker, the keel of the boat.
Yeah, so this is a shot of that having sinking down. At this point, we've gone alongside the very end of their pier, which the dry dock is alongside. But they wanted us in that position before they sank the dry dock. So that's our position leading up to them sinking the dry dock and then taking in the ship.
Sure. And that's me in the little red boat there, standing by.
oh yeah. You can. So okay, now the dry dock is sunk, and we're manhandling with lines, and you in the rubber boat. Fortunately, it was a very relatively. It had a bit of a breezy day to it, but it wasn't hard to manage. It wasn't overly strong. So, and it was coming out of the northwest. So we were hanging off the other pier. So we hand walked her back into the walls, between the walls of the dry dock. And those cutouts of the winter covers, as people can communicate. There was a lot of consternation at first trying to understand us hauling out with that cover on board, but we've done it once before back in the 90s, and been so long the yard couldn't remember that. But as you can see, we were able to do it. So now she's a bit out of the water. What is not caught yet, we don't have that photograph, but the dry dock actually comes up underneath the it's. Yeah, okay, the detail's not there. So because the blocking under the center is oriented to be minimal wood, they don't have to build up the bow a lot to keep the waterline level. They allow the ship to go bow down. So they have to actually create drag in the dry dock. So there you go. See that? See the angularity, the old paint, there's the wet line, and then there's the wall, top of the wall. You can see how the wet line gets smaller and smaller as it goes towards the bow. So what's happened was, what you've seen there is they've had to raise the far end of the dry dock before the near end. in order to get relatively parallel for the blocking to match the rocker. Then when they have that set, they lift and get a little bit of loading. And when they check a few things, they then go through the process of picking up more weight before they bring in the side blocking. And then take the drag of the dry dock out and make her float square. This presents a little bit of a stability challenge. So that dry dock has to have so much tankage subdivision, that as they empty certain tanks and keep other tanks full, that there's no risk of having a capsize of the dry dock itself as it picks up this new weight at an angle. And so there's a lot of consideration to the business of maintaining stable buoyancy at these different angles for the dry dock. And the dry dock is purposely designed this way, with a great deal of subdivision for reasons of being able to control for how the weight lands on the dry dock as they lift, as well as the business of our drag with a shallower bow and a deeper stern.
Sure. Pat, you want to cycle through some photos here of the boat coming fully out of the water? So there you can see the dry dock pushing out the water as the boat's coming out. And we didn't get too much higher than this. We're about maybe like a foot out of the water on the leading edge there.
Right. Yeah, there's no reason to. The harbor is well protected. There's no big sea rolling in, no matter what the wind is doing. And so, about 10 to 12, 14 inches out of the water. They can change that a little bit, but because of the protection of the North Branch, the so-called inner harbor, no reason to be worried about that.
Yeah, so from this point, kind of one of the main differences from working at General Ship versus working down at Ocean Marine in Portsmouth, to get alongside the ship, relatively easy when you're in the middle of a parking lot. You can just bring in, your cherry pickers, your man lifts, and you're good to go. At General Ship here, we actually had to get a crane in to lift all of the man lifts onto the dry dock to kind of wheel around in the cavern there. And you can also see how big those sides are and how much shade that is providing to the hull, as Jan was pointing out earlier. So now that the boat is out of the water, what happens? You succeeded. Well, we're out of the water.
Well, the yard, they go away and do other jobs other than the specific preparations or anything we have to move in terms of weight. There's certain things they do for us, like take the propellers off and get them ashore, because we like to take our propellers up to the manufacturer, if not every haul out, every other haul out, depending upon our frequency. But once that's all the water hookup, the electrical hookup, the man lifts loaded, the props taken off, then the yard crew are off to other jobs, while we, as the wood people, the winter crew, and anybody we bring in as a contracting assistance to handle the care of the planking underneath the waterline, come in, and we use the man lifts, our crew and anybody else we bring in, to do the caulking maintenance that we do. We do a lot of regular maintenance caulking, as well as any reason to do anything more, and then take care of the paint. So we're left to our own devices, except for those specific things that the yard can do until the boat's ready to paint, final coat paint, and then the yard handles the final coating.
Sure. So let's kind of parse that out a little bit. Let's start with the caulking. So routine caulking, to kind of describe that process a little bit, it starts with an activity called reefing, and that's where you take out the putty so you can see the oakum underneath, and depending on the condition of the oakum, you start to reef that out. And I did a little drawing here before you start showing other photos there, Patrick, to kind of show you the cross section of a plank. So right here, let me get a pointy device. We have the seam, the plank seam here, and we basically have 3 layers of stuff inside of the seam. So we have a layer of cotton all the way drove into this wedge shape here. So this seam has a wedge that doesn't go all the way into the inner edge of the plank. It goes about halfway, maybe a little bit more, 2/3 of the way. So you start with a layer of cotton, and then we actually do 2 passes of oakum to fill up kind of the rest of the space there. So you have your first pass, your second pass, and then you put putty on from the outside. So when we're looking at areas that were, that may need some maintenance, we're kind of examining the putty on the outside to see what shape that's in. And from there, we'll start to inspect these layers to see what shape they're in as well. So Pat, I think you have some photos that show that process of getting into the caulking. There's Ryan Graham swinging a hammer. He's done quite a bit of caulking on the boat. I've done some as well. This is from the last haul out that we did at General Ship. This is up in kind of midships area. And I'm laying in a pass of oakum here. So when you go to reef this out, you have to be pretty diligent that you're not actually taking out any wood in the seam. So you want to take your time as you pull out old material, and then you want to pack in that new material. And that first starts with, caulking irons and swinging just by hand, and then we'll actually go back and do what's called horsing, which I think there's a photo in there of horsing, which is using a huge mallet and another person holding another iron. And that actually kind of gets the final tamp down into the seam. From there, you lock in kind of the surface of that oakum that you've then kind of pushed in. So there's a former partner captain of the boat, Jamie Trost, and myself, 12 years ago. That's down at Ocean Marine, horsing in along the Deadwood there. So after that's all horsed in, you paint over the oakum inside the seam, and then you come in and you lay your putty on top. Can you talk about some of the areas that get caulked the most and why they get caulked the most?
Well, you take a first look at butts. The vessel, as it undulates through the sea, creates more movement at the ends or the planks together, the butts. So you examine them somewhat first, but you also take note of what's happened to the paint to the hull as the vessel is cleaned off from a period of time in the water by the pressure washer. And so if you're new to a yard, you have to talk to the pressure washer people to make sure they don't actually blow all the paint off along with all the caulking putty, because now you got nothing but a lot of work, if not also some damage. So we want it washed off clean. They don't want to take the paint off. And for a yard that is working in steel, that's a big conversation. For a yard that's used to wooden vessels, that's usually not a big misunderstanding or potential misunderstanding. So when we get the dirt cleaned off, we can see where things have broken in terms of the layer of paint over the caulking. And an area that's pretty common is underneath and in line with masts. So the mast step area and the chain plate area, that area of that vertical alignment can indicate if there's been a fair amount of a little bit of movement. So that means it's going to be grinding the caulking. That doesn't mean the ship is unseaworthy. It just means that there's movement. So you go, and every time you haul out, there are 2 things you're looking for. You can assume that butts ought to be worked because of that business of grinding against each other. But you then look at other areas where the putty has fallen out, and sometimes it just plain falls out. Back aft can be sometimes an area near the waterline, more often up to the forward near the waterline. There's a lot of surging that goes on near the waterline up forward because you plow through the water, hit the waves, and what have you. Also, that air-water interface means the planking is going through a bit of drying and wetting and drying and wetting, and at the surface, that can be very problematic for the stability of the putty. The gap that the putty is filled will be compressed, shrinking and widening and shrinking and widening just there near the surface of the planking. So that's an area where we frequently see putty up forward sort of disturbed, but the stress factors are another one. And so down below the water line, well below the water line, we can see some movement of planking underneath the mast steps, that sort of stuff. So on a boat as big as Pride, with a number of wood lengths that it has and layers, horizontal layers, that's just a lot of work. But then as the vessel ages and dries out while it's hauled out, we can get situations down low where we want to really harden things up as the vessel ages to just keep up with the changing dimension of the wood.
Yeah, and it's, also natural fibers will wear out eventually. The cotton, the oakum, they're all natural fibers. So eventually you need to get in there and replace them. And I think we have some photos of putting in some splines. So every once in a while, and we've experienced this more underneath the quarters, so underneath kind of the stern of the boat, there'll be some drying out of the plank where, showing this seam here, this gap opens up enough that if you were to try and drive in cotton, it's just going to shoot out the other side. When that happens, a good fix for that is actually gluing in basically a new plank edge. And Pat's going to pull up some of those photos. It's a pretty neat process to watch.
Yeah, so green built vessels. So there's in the late 1800s, coming to recent time, with recreational boating growing and growing, yachting growing and growing and growing, it was feasible. There was enough money to set wood aside and get it really, really dry for construction. That's not feasible for these larger vessel projects such as Pride, because you're on a deadline. It's symbolic. And so it's very hard. When you're fundraising, people are saying, when are you going to be built? What's your schedule? When do you need the money? And when are you going to be done? Well, you want to celebrate. So there's no stockpile of wood with those kinds of thicknesses that we have. We're upwards of 3 and 4 inches of thickness in our planking to have it dry. So the result is that the air-water interface, particularly in the ends where you get a lot of reflection due to the overhanging part of the vessel above water and the sun reflecting off the water, you can get some concentrated heat situations. And so the green wood shrinks and it keeps shrinking. I mean, it doesn't shrink and swell. If you have a dry wood built boat, it's so dry when it goes in the water, it swells up. And so then as you do a cycle of dry docking and refloating and dry docking, it'll shrink, but it'll shrink from a swollen point, not shrink further from the original status as the vessel was launched after construction. In the case of Pride, we're having an average amount of continuing additional shrinkage of the planking. So we have to keep up with that. And maybe it requires this battening process, this wedging, adding, as you pointed out, Jeff, this adding wood to the side of the plank to close a gap. And it's pretty common. It's not strange. It's just a matter of keeping up with normal caulking until it becomes problematic to get the caulkers to work against a open gap against a closing gap. So we get the carpenters out.
Yeah, and you can see that process here, and you can imagine kind of how fiddly it is to shape all of those wedges, because in a perfect world, that seam is going to be nice and uniform all the way across. But of course, we don't live in a perfect world. So the seam changes in its diameter slightly. So you have to shape for that because you're looking for a really nice, snug fit into that seam to really recreate that plank edge. We did get a question in from Nancy Aldrich. She asked, did they have putty in the 1800s and what did they use? They did have putty. They didn't have the type of putty that we have now, which is more manufactured and has chemicals in it. But they had things like pine pitch mixed with pine tar, mixed with wax. And pretty much every single shipyard and boat builder is going to have their own concoction of something that they would shove into those seams to kind of seal that gap. Cap, do you have any historical anecdotes to throw into that?
Well, you read with the cargo schooner world, you read about how cement can be used in some situations, which is sort of startling when you consider that if the wood is moving all the time because it's near the air-water interface, that cement is going to be so hard. It's just going to mean that if the wood is in a state of swelling against the cement, it's either going to push the cement out or get crushed. So that's an interesting thing to puzzle over. But these are not backyard sort of experiments that have been suddenly realized. There's a history of cement use that's been very successful. We don't do that. There's a lot of talk in the very, very early days of wooden vessels of trying to deal with the problem by you not only put in some kind of compound, but you then sheathe the planking with either wood, thin wood, or a copper was a thing that was used for a bit. To try to cover it. Today, we don't try to cover it. We keep it accessible, visible, inspectable from the outside. We're using a compound. Now, on deck, we're using pitch because we have gravity. It's easy to do to fill in the seams. When you're on the side of the boat, it needs to be thick enough that you can trowel it in, it'll stay there. So there's that dynamic to worry about.
Yeah, and linseed oil and limestone is basically the two main components of the putty that we use now. So I mean, it hasn't evolved to the point where we're shoving plastic in. It's still largely natural materials. We use a putty that was called slick seam, which is basically its main component is wax. So it stays pretty malleable. So it's all more natural materials, waxes and oils, some pitch for rot resistance, things of that nature, shoved into these seams. But really, at the end of the day, as Ryan Graham is fond of saying, whatever works, works.
Yeah, so the challenge is will it be soft enough to go with the swelling? Will it be sticky enough to follow the wood as it shrinks? And so,
yeah.
We'll find situations where even something as sticky as the slick seam will have pulled away from the edge of a plank just because of the movement and the age of the wax, or the amount of movement. So that's always, we're always attending to the seams every time we haul out. There is no time where you do just a wash and a repaint. You do a lot of work, all that's needed for the seams, because that's not only the watertight integrity question, but it's also the rigidity of the ship question. It's a support system as well as a water integrity system. And in today's world with fiberglass monocoque construction, be it steel or synthetics or laminated wood, you don't run into that problem. But with pieces like this, it's important to stay after the caulking.
Sure. Nancy also has another question. How'd they haul these boats in the 1800s without modern lifting devices? And did they haul out every winter or ever?
Yeah, well, we talk about careening. It's done a number of ways. You wait for the tide to go away. You just let her sit on the beach, then rush in, go to work for 5 hours or 6 hours, and then you might have to come back 2 or 3 times. But another possibility is that you come in, you do only one side of the boat, and you can. There's some fascinating drawings of vessels hove down by rigging tackle to their stout masts, the stout part of the mast, and they'll take a square rigger and lay it down, still afloat, but they'll lay it way, 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 way over, and the buoyancy of the boat will allow for working. That's quite a visual thing for us today, but would be not uncommon back in those days. So no, they would work on them. It might be 4 or 5 years. Take a look at a whaling ship. You know, they're underway for more than a year and could be even longer. And then they come back and they get slower and slower and slower as time goes by with all the growth. And then they find an opportunity to do this type of stuff.
Yeah, and you know, graving docks and railways are not new technology by any means. They're pretty old technology.
Yeah, there's a great big graving dock over at Sparrows Point. It's huge, and you can find photographs of the Constellation here in Baltimore, the Naval Vessel Museum Constellation, as well as the one of the other Inner Harbor Museum boats, the submarine, I think. And it's a huge graving dock. And graving dock is a phrase that's describing a hole in the ground with a door on one end, and that door has got valves in it, or some kind of valve system within the framework of the graving dock, made of stone. We used to have one near Fort McHenry that's been converted to storage, or maybe even filled in. But what happens is you have a valve system to let water in. You float the door away, or you swing the door away. The boat comes in and is positioned, and then you close the door, and then you pump the water out. And they had pumps way, way, way earlier, or a system of being able to pump out. Maybe it's by buckets and horses or something, but you can get the water out. And as you get the water out, the vessel is dropping down on to a pre-constructed cradle and blocking. And so then you have this hole in the ground with a door. Hope the door doesn't break.
Holding up the water at bay. Yeah. So kind of similar to the lock system, you know, but more geared to just boat maintenance. Another thing that happens when the boat is hauled out is we take the props off, and we have large folding props made by Luke Props up in Maine, and then they go on an adventure. And I think we have a folder of the last person's photos who took the props on this adventure. And I think he's watching this morning. Good morning, Stan. So longtime volunteer, friend of the boat, Stan, came down to the ship while we were hauled out at General Ship, and took these props and took them away. So what happens when these props go away, Cap?
So there's an operation up in Maine called Luke, and they're a small boat yard, mostly yachts of various types. And they long ago they bought their family bought patterns that had been created by somebody else, can't remember who, to the business of feathering blades that were automatic. They rotate. We don't so much fold as we rotate feathers. You can see those two, that photo there with Stan himself. On one side, the blades are in a position to propel the vessel either forward or astern. On the other side, they're oriented so that they create the least amount of resistance and drag going through the water as we're sailing. And so this automatic system can wear a little bit. So what we do is on a relatively regular basis, we send them up to the manufacturer to be taken apart and examined and cleaned up. And so this has been since 1988 when the boat was built. These are the same propellers. So our regular maintenance inspection system keeps everything just right. So they require a fair amount of grease. We sometimes dive on the props during a season to add more grease. But that's what is that? Nearly a round trip of what, 1,200 miles or something like that. Got to go to East Booth Bay, Maine, and then back again. And with a fellow like Stan, it means that we're just paying for transportation and food and fuel. And when we have to do it on our own, it's we lose a couple of crew members, or maybe one if it's got enough time. Sometimes we're in a rush, got to get it up there, got to get it back, got to get them on, because we've got to relaunch the boat. So in this case, we weren't in an all fired up rush. So Stan could take his time, plan his own way of going up on his own, making stops at locations of acquaintances along the way. Then idlest time. It takes a day to work a non-repair situation, but in this case, there was a need to do some extended wear replacement fix. The props were fine. It's just that there was extended wear. So he had a couple of days to play with.
Yeah, so typically every time that we haul out, we take off the props and we send them up to Maine to get serviced. I recall one year where that didn't happen, and it was rather eventful. And Patrick, if you can go back a couple of photos, there's a photo of showing the teeth inside the, so, and you can see that they're building up some metal on the teeth, because as you can imagine, any gear over time, as it's moving in its components, starts to wear, so they're replacing that metal. So Captain Miles, can you start off the story of what happened with this eventful prop misadventure?
I really don't want to tell that story.
Okay. That's fair.
So, well, we did a dry dock, and we had so much good performance. It was decided that we didn't need to move the props up to the yard. And a day later, after relaunching, one of the props hung up in a specific way and would not perform. So I think you and was it Captain Trost?
Yeah, myself and Captain Trost and Keith Barkwood helped at one point. Dove on the prop and set up the prop puller underwater. And thankfully, we had enough foresight to think about the reinstallation of the prop in the future. So we figured out a way to take the prop off and basically make it neutrally buoyant. And so we kept that same amount of, I think we used some partially inflated fenders and some other things, some floats, in order to make the prop neutrally buoyant. And we did that before we took it all the way off. So we had the right amount of neutral buoyancy when we got the prop back. And then we threw the prop in the back of a rental car, and Captain Trost and myself drove nonstop up to Maine, got it serviced, and then drove back. And by that point, you had transited the boat from Portsmouth up to Baltimore, right?
Yeah, so the beauty of Pride of Baltimore 2's design construction is that she has a lot of reserve capacity. So a sailboat with a lot of sails and 2 masts and yards has a lot of flexibility for getting from one place to another. In a modern world, instead of just one engine, we have 2 with 2 shafts, 2 propellers, and one engine can operate that vessel very, very well. And so we were without, other than handling the fact that she changes her handling characteristics at the dock, everything else is pretty normal. So we were able to make 6-7 knots straight on back up to Baltimore in moderate conditions. And so we didn't lose our schedule about getting ready for the next phase of the season. So after dry dock, so we weren't going to operate other than move the boat around for the crew, getting ready for the next engagement. So that worked out really well. You guys came back and refloated the props onto the shafts. Which, by the way, this is not the first time that props have come off the shafts while in the water. The first time it happened was during the construction transition phase to commissioning, where we needed to repitch the propellers. So the boat was in the water. The divers went down. They had this arrangement made that you describe, and in one short period of time, of less than a daylight day, I think it was less than 6 hours, the props came off. They came up on the dock. They got repitched. The props went back on again. Bada boom, bada bang. But you guys were very thoughtful about, okay, it's one thing to take it off. It's another thing to get it back on. So you guys worked all that figuring out ahead of time, and that was great. So and the reason why I regret having to even tell the damn story is that the boat was out of the water. Let's check the props.
One of those things that you kind of learn over the time. There's sometimes kind of a gut feeling of we should probably just do this because it's available, it's here, and you should oftentimes respond to those gut feelings. That's awesome. Well, I think that does it for us here. We're going over the hour a little bit. I just want to thank everybody who has joined us for this conversation this morning. And thank you to those that donated. That helps keep this program going. And just thank you to everyone who has tuned in throughout the year. This has been really awesome to be able to show off the boat, even though we're not sailing. So thank you for those of you that have participated with us throughout the year. And we will be back doing Coffee with Captain in the new year. So stay tuned for that. And Captain Miles, do you have any parting words for us this morning?
Well, other than in addition to echoing you thank you very much for joining us and being a part of this. Stay diligent, everyone.